Can the panel please recite a poem that they learnt by rote at school and explain how this has been useful in their subsequent careers?
Which poor sap is going to have to start on this one?
Twinkle, twinkle, little star.
What works? What actually is effective?
Politicians should listen to the experts, and the experts are teachers.
If we're going to change this every 5 years as another government comes in, it's pretty depressing.
I trust the teachers rather than some boffin in Whitehall.
It is the land of lost content. I see it shining plain, those happy highways where I went and cannot come again.
Hello, Reform Mythologist Nate Morgan-Locke here to talk about a video the YouTube algorithm served up to me which I haven't been able to stop thinking about. It's a panel discussion from June 2012 from BBC Current Affairs programme Question Time. It addresses the importance of the arts, which we take very seriously on this channel, and once I've broken it down, I'm going to explain why the final answer absolutely smashes it. The context of this discussion was that way back in history, before COVID or Brexit were recognisable words, the then Education Secretary, Michael Gove, proposed that school children ought to learn poems off by heart. Anyway, here's presenter David Dimbleby introducing the panellists so we can get into who thinks it's a good idea and who think it's a bad idea, and most importantly, why.
And on our panel here, the Housing Minister, Grant Shapps, the Shadow Attorney General, Emily Thornberry, the President of the Liberal Democrats, Tim Farron, the Mail on Sunday columnist, Peter Hitchens, and the former Director General of the BBC, who the Prime Minister today said was no shrinking violet, Greg Dyke.
So those were the panellists, but let's just remember the specific question being discussed.
Can the panel please recite a poem that they learnt by rote at school and explain how this has been useful in their subsequent careers?
Notice the two-part nature of the question. Can you recite a poem? And secondly, how has this been useful in your subsequent career? The underlying assumption here is that education is primarily about future utility and practical application to working life, as though we should only ever learn things which we will need to use in our paid employment. I want to question that assumption later, but first let's see how the panellists answered it.
Which poor sap is going to have to start on this one? Grant Shapps, can you recite a poem you learned by rote at school and tell us how useful it was?
Twinkle, twinkle, little star. I can't actually, and it's probably been my undoing. I think that what Michael Gove...
feeble effort that was.
Oh, sorry. What Michael... We're going to test you next. What Michael Gove wants to do is kind of get school children learning the basics. So you come out with the ability to kind of add up, to be able to read, to write, to a sort of proficient level. And I started a printing company 20-something years ago, and I remember the frustration of just kind of going to that Job Centre Plus that we were talking about in the previous question and just trying to find people with the basic skills. I wasn't looking for people who had the advanced skills for the printing equipment. I was looking for people who were able to simply perform the tasks. And actually, I think there's a lot to be said for getting back to a curriculum which does that, so people come out with some basic disciplines. Now, poetry and reciting poems actually is an exercise in remembering things, being able to commit things to memory, use that information later on. It's not about the poem itself, it's about the skill that you learn whilst you're doing it.
It's not about the poem itself. Wow. The poem itself is not important. You just need to memorize something, because being able to memorize things might be useful in the future. I don't believe this is the point, but this view of the purpose of education being to become the most effective cog in a societal machine is echoed by Greg Dyke. Here's what he says.
I'm the Chancellor of the University at York. At York we have an Institute for Effective Education, which basically says what works. And it seems to me we're all hidebound, all of us, by the education we have, where we came from, what we believe in, our politics. And I would much rather we looked and said, OK, what works? What actually is effective in teaching kids mathematics, in teaching kids to read and write at an early age? Let's look at what's effective and put it into place.
Education is apparently, according to this view, about efficiency. But there's also another issue here being assumed. There is a deeper question about education that several of the people on this panel don't actually address because they don't want to challenge the underlying assumptions of the question. This question is, what kind of people should the education system produce? Now, there's another element here to this debate, which is the political aspect to the programme. I think this slightly overshadows the interesting part of this discussion on the value of memorisation and poetry and art, but it means that the discussion involves a fair degree of the panellists playing to the gallery and scoring points by saying how wonderful teachers are and how terrible politicians are. Essentially, politicians, according to the panellists, should stay out of the classroom.
I'm not sure we should elect politicians to decide the curriculums in school.
Notice how he gets a round of applause. The popular answer is to denigrate politicians. Teachers are all amazing, and politicians are, well, as described by Tim Farron in this next clip, boffins in Whitehall.
For my kids, I trust the teachers at our school in Millthorpe in Cumbria and their head teacher to decide the priorities for what my kids should learn rather than some boffin in Whitehall, and I'm not going to go at Gove.
You aren't having a go at it.
I wasn't calling him the boffin in Whitehall.
But what about the Secretary of State in Whitehall?
Well, I mean, it's fine to fly kites, but, you know, I'm a
This
politician.
isn't a kite. This is, he says, this is going to be introduced in September 2014.
Well, I mean, what we've done is actually, I mean, the coalition government has reduced the size of the national curriculum to give more choice to teachers. And I would just question Michael Gove's consistency in that case, given that, you know, we are trying to reduce the burdens on teachers, allow them to teach, concentrate on what they're good at. Politicians should set general terms of debate. We should not be meddling in the classroom.
So this idea that politicians are meddling in the classroom and the politicians are bad and teachers know what they're doing and they're always good is, I think, a bit of a distraction from the really interesting stuff about the value of memorising poetry. But nonetheless, Emily Thornberry takes the same view. Now, she begins by quoting a poem by A.A. Milne, which is a firm favourite of my family.
James Morrison, Wetherby George Dupree, took great care of his mother.
That'd be enough. Thank you very much.
It's the best effort so far.
I think that I think that a lot of the contributions that have been made so far are right. I think that it is not the job of politicians to meddle in the minutiae of the curriculum. I think that it is important. I think that the league tables were important. I think that it is important for parents to be reassured that children are spending a certain amount of time a week on the basics. But I think otherwise, you know, politicians should listen to the experts, and the experts are teachers. And we have excellent teachers out there, and we should trust them.
So we need to trust the teachers, and maybe the politician stuff is all a bit of a distraction from the interesting conversation. But the idea that memorising, back to that key topic, memorising poetry, the idea is suggested that it's actually a waste of time. This is said by a lady who works with young children.
I teach 5-year-olds and we've been doing poetry and they love exploring it, they love reading it, they love writing it, their own, etc, etc. Making them sit down and recite poems would just be a waste of my time and a waste of their time, and I would love Michael Gove to actually come into school and try and teach 5-year-olds poetry and see what he
Now, it's interesting that the 5-year-olds in this lady's classroom love poetry, but if they had to recite any, that would be the worst. But the key thing is, children love reciting things. They are little sponges. The repetition of poems and nursery rhymes and songs makes up a considerable part of a child's experience in their first few years. And in fact, it reminded me of a famous speech given by the English author Dorothy L. Sayers at Oxford University in 1947. It is called The Lost Tools of Learning, and she's talking about classical education and why it's possibly the most child-friendly approach to learning. She says there are 3 stages of development which correspond to the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric. The first, she says, is the poll-parrot stage. Quote, "The poll-parrot stage is the one in which learning by heart is easy and, on the whole, pleasurable. whereas reasoning is difficult and, on the whole, little relished. So rather than being an external imposition of an educational doctrine, learning poems off by heart is apparently the most natural thing a child could do. Anyway, we can chat more about classical education in the comments, but let's get back to the discussion. Another major problem the panellists see is that this methodology is outdated and therefore unfit for 21st century British children.
I think quite clearly, Gove in the, whenever it was, 60s or 70s, had a childhood that he clearly enjoyed, and he clearly enjoyed being at school. And I think that he looks at our modern schools and wants to kind of somehow or other import in education that frankly is largely out of date. I don't think that learning the names of the kings and queens of England is the most important thing to learn in history. I think you need to have an understanding of why we are where we are. If you don't understand your history, you are doomed to continue to make the same mistakes. So I think we've got a lot to learn from history, not just learning the names of the kings and queens. But if you listen to Gove, that's the kind of thing that he wants, because that's the sort of thing that was being done in the schools in the 50s and 60s. We have moved on since then.
It's fascinating that she believes that we have moved on since then. We still have a constitutional monarchy in this country. There is only one more name of a king to learn since this episode of Question Time was recorded. Charles III, if you're wondering. Now, I'm not exactly sure that learning the names of the kings and queens in order would be not learning history. It would simply give you the framework by which history could be then understood. But anyway, the questions about how we converse with history comes up in the answer given by journalist Peter Hitchens. Now, the first thing he is going to do is to demonstrate the power and the value of poetry. And it is going to totally change the atmosphere in the room.
Are you in favour of these proposals that Michael Gove puts forward?
You don't want me to pass this test?
Well, all right, you can spell accommodate. Spell accommodate.
A-C-O-M-M-A-O-D-A-T-E. But I'll do your poem as well, because I've been asked to. Into my heart an air that kills from yon far country blows. What are those blue remembered hills? What spires, what farms are those? It is the land of lost content. I see it shining plain, those happy highways where I went and cannot come again. And I'm very pleased. I'm very pleased that my head is full of things like that, and also lots of hymns which I remember, and I feel very sorry for anybody who hasn't had the chance to learn them. And I think it is a great condemnation of our school system that so few people, and particularly only those whose parents are rich, can actually afford to have their children taught things like that and have their minds furnished with beauty for the remainder of their lives. And to pour scorn on it and to say that it is unimportant is to declare yourself a spiritual desert. Of course people need these things, and what's more, they're a profound part of being British. If you don't know the literature and the poetry and the music of your own country, then you aren't really fully conversant with its history or its character. You've lost touch with what your ancestors knew, and you won't be able to pass it on to your own children and grandchildren. Of course these things should be taught. I wish Michael Gove actually had the power and the policies to make it happen. I really do think it would be a good thing. I also think that people particularly teachers, should not say that these things don't matter. They matter immensely.
The poem Hitchens recites is the most powerful moment in the debate. He makes the poem work as poetry, and we'll pick up on the particular poem he quotes shortly. But he also gives a deep rationale for bothering with poetry at all. He says he's very pleased that his mind is furnished with beauty. It's a shame that beauty as a fundamental aspect of education seems to have been lost by those who see it as simply a means to an end, utility in a subsequent career. And the flip side of a mind furnished with beauty is a person who, as Peter Hitchens describes them, is a spiritual desert. There is an emptiness or a barrenness to the utilitarian approach to education. But I also want to come back to Grant Shapps' point that the poem itself is somehow irrelevant. The other poems referred to in this discussion were Twinkle Twinkle Little Star and James James Morrison Morrison by A.A. Milne. Great fun answers as they go, but slightly missing the point by refusing to take the arts as seriously as Peter Hitchens does in his answer. What is the poem that he chooses? Well, it's from a collection of poems called A Shropshire Lad by A.E. Houseman. Into my heart an air that kills from yon far country blows. What are those blue remembered hills? What spires, what farms are those? That is the land of lost content. I see it shining plain. The happy highways where I went and cannot come again. This is about yearning, nostalgia, what the Germans call Sehnsucht and what the Welsh call Hiraeth. The deep sense that not only have we had to leave the past behind us, but that our very yearning for the past is pointing to a deeper spiritual exile. That as human beings, we are all outside a locked door. And this poem demonstrates the sneaking suspicion that art and beauty and poetry might help us to recognize our need and maybe even point us in the right direction. Anyway, I'd love to get your thoughts on all this, so please feel free to leave a comment down below. Please do remember that media consumption is optional. You are under no obligation to watch current affairs programs from over a decade ago. I'm Reform Mythologist Nate Morgan Locke. I'm glad you are here.